So for me, Leon's proposition of the three poles, the idea that for any individual, it's possible to define your own position and to have a close understanding of two alternate positions that you in some way oppose, but where you find the having to have that opposition, having to redefine your own position in relation to those other two positions constantly provides strength and much greater clarity to your own positioning.
So how do you think those three things, urbanism, advanced architecture, and let's say the expanded field or a kind of a pluralist position within itself, how do you think those three are defined individually and then combined, if you like, as opposites?
I think if I'm looking at it from a school perspective, I would generalise it even more to one of tectonics, poetics, and society or civics. And really, that's they're the three poles as far as I see them operating at a school level. And of course, we're still trying to work out what that means in a number of the other disciplines. I think fashion has begun to be reasonably clear about how it's operating in relation to those three generalised views. Landscape's done some work, and industrial design are trying to find where they might fit within that, and interior will similarly be trying to work that out. So what I think for a school, the reason I think that's very strong is it means that there's a certain vibrancy among the staff body in terms of who they align with. You know, how do you position your own work in relation to those clusters? And at RMIT, we're not being dogmatic about them. You know, we don't have to label you a poet, and you know, you just got to defend the ground, come what may. I mean, you might actually shift occasionally from one to the other, and we see those poles. I mean, I prefer to talk about them as constellations rather than poles. They're things that are forming and reforming. They're centres of energy, if you like, rather than silos of knowledge that are protecting themselves. But they benefit from their engagement with the other two poles. Now, from an education point of view, the reason I think that's very strong is that we can then curate our studios and identify with students that when they're selecting studios, they're selecting either one that aligns with a poetics pole, or one that aligns with a tectonics pole, or one that aligns with a society and civics pole. The reason that that's important is that it means that as soon as you do that, in order to make that choice, you're instantly put in the position where you have to develop some understanding of the three of them. So instead of coming away with like no idea, just some sense of who you are as a designer, or some singular idea of how architecture is practiced, you're all the time trying to grapple with multiple positions. And I think what will be the strength of our graduates coming out of that program is an ability to locate themselves in relation to those three poles. And that location might not necessarily be within one of the poles, it might actually be somewhere else. And we would hope that over time there's tensions and pull and shift in and around the three poles so that it's not an ossifying condition. What I think we need to move on to then is to say, okay, well, internally within the discipline that makes sense as a description of what's going on, but it's very difficult to engage with wider society through that description. I mean, it's to define the difference between tectonics and poetics and civics in an architectural endeavour is a very, very particular conversation. And I think another great quality of or another really important education quality is to be able to allow students to engage in issues that are real to the wider world and not just real to your internalised discipline. So I think what we need to begin to look at as we move our strategic plan forward is how do we create what I might call fields of endeavour that we can then use our three-pole position to engage with. So we could say, okay, an example might be climate change is a current field of endeavour that has currency and that is of interest. So you might say, okay, well, can we create studios across the three poles that, and across our 5 disciplines, maybe even disciplines from outside architecture and design, that engage with this question of climate change. So can we use that, if you like, as a theme or a field of endeavour that then makes sense to people outside of architecture?
Do you think that architects are not necessarily incapable, but they seem to struggle communicating what it is that they do to the greater public? Do you think this gives a tool or an ability to maybe try and explain what is important about architecture to a wider community?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think there's a danger in this as well, because if you take something like climate change, people instantly understand figures. So they understand that you might mitigate temperature increase or something by a certain degree. What's harder to evaluate is how a particular spatial arrangement might allow a certain engagement with a place that is more powerful than some other arrangement. It's interesting though, because as far as I can see, people respond unbelievably positively to really good examples of architecture. So they do get it. People who spend time at Federation Square get the idea that this is a really great public place, which is probably one of the finest qualities of that particular project, to make a really great public place in a city that prior to Federation Square was struggling to find an urban centre, if you like, or a place in the urban, in the CBD where people congregated as a group. So people seem to recognise that. They do it intuitively, I think.
So does that then reinforce this notion of a culturally significant building that you described as an aspiration for Terroir? And that notion of architecture's ability to talk across a whole level of engagement is something which is kind of interesting. It's that sort of tension on the back of the neck test. When you walk into a space and you just can feel your head kind of tilting back. How do you teach that? How do you teach the ability to kind of to recognise that when that has occurred?
It is about developing self-critical skills, I think. I mean, this is exactly what you're asking. How do you develop self-critical skills? How do you develop the ability to see in your own work when something works and when it doesn't? That is the most difficult thing in teaching design, full stop, and in this case particularly architecture.